Welcome to Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston, PhD. Dr. Glenn is a clinical psychologist and former multi-million-dollar consultant to the big food industry and uses his experience to help you defeat your cravings. This show will help you to focus on dramatically reducing cravings and leaving the diet mentality behind, so you can more easily and effortlessly achieve your health, fitness, and body composition goals. Please remember, no doctor-patient relationship is created via this show, and you are responsible for confirming any changes to your diet, health, or psychological routines with an appropriately licensed professional before implementing them. Before we get started, if you haven't downloaded the free smartphone app to access dozens of these recordings all in one place, as well as to avail yourself of a confidential community for support, motivation, and assistance, please visit the podcast link on defeatyourcravings.com as soon as possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Hey, it's the very good Dr. Glenn Livingston with DefeatYourCravings.com. I'm here with John Chancellor from Teach the Soul. How are you, John?
I'm doing well, and how are you?
I'm doing very well. Looking forward to talking to you as always.
Good. So, do you have something on your mind first, or?
What's on my mind is I want to know what's on your mind.
Okay. So, I know we've been talking about your new program, Defeat Your Food Cravings, or Defeat Your Cravings. And I was thinking that when people come into your program, they often come with a lot of preconceived notions about things. And I was wondering if it would be helpful to share some of the common misconceptions about food rules and food cravings and how your program works that people generally show up with. So what are some of the misconceptions or poor thinking traps that people show up?
I can talk about both of those things. Most common misconception that people have is that I'm going to tell them what to eat. As long as they have a reasonable amount of nutrition on a regular basis and they're not trying to lose 30 pounds in 30 days or starve themselves in some way, I find that it's actually critical that they come up with their own dietary philosophy and their own set of food rules. I'm not 100% sure of the reason that's so critical. I know that when I drift into trying to tell people what I think would be healthier for them, which everybody wants to do. Everybody wishes that everybody else ate like they did. It would be an easier world if people just agreed with them, right?
Right.
But if I drift into that, people get rebellious and it just doesn't work. And so I've come to the conclusion that autonomy of food choice is critical for overcoming overeating. I think it's because part of what drives overeating is the experience of having been fed against our own best interest or told that things were supposed to be good for us that weren't, or I don't know exactly, but it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that people start with a simple rule or two that they really believe would make the biggest difference for them. So I tell my coaches to stay out of the way, and I stay out of the way, unless people are really trying to starve themselves, in which case I speak up.
So you give the people a lot of autonomy. And I've heard it used a lot in business that if people come up with their own idea, their own solution, they're much more likely to implement it, follow it, believe in it than if I, as a coach or consultant, tell them what to do.
Because otherwise it's got the not invented here syndrome, right?
Absolutely. Not invented here. It's and you can see it. It's so prevalent. That's tremendous that you give them autonomy. So what are some of the incorrect thinking, or what are some of the thinking traps that tend to plague most of the people that show up for your program?
Most people, my program is not the first program they've ever tried.
Mm-hmm.
Most people have tried a million diets and a million different diet programs. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why it's so critical to have autonomy of food choice, because we're trying to help you craft a way of eating that will work for you for the rest of your life. We're specifically working against the diet mentality. But most people feel like, well, how could this be any different? I've failed 1,000 times before. That's proof that there's something wrong with me, that I'm broken or powerless, or should just accept being a happy fat person or something like that. It's not worth trying again. It's a very debilitating thought that really prevents progress if you don't address it head on.
How would you address it head on? What approach neutralizes that way of thinking?
First of all, There's research that shows that the one of the biggest differences between people who lose weight and keep it off for 5 years versus people who go up and down is the number of times that they tried and failed before that. What do you think that research found?
Uh, well, I'm guessing because again, I see it a lot in business. In business, I have so many clients that are afraid to actually pull the trigger on something because they're afraid they're going to fail. And I constantly remind them that the greatest success, or the people that have the greatest number of success, have a much higher number of failures. That is, they've failed a lot more, and that failing is not bad unless you view it as failure. So if you view it as an experiment, if you view it as a learning experience, then it's good.
That's exactly what the research says in food also.
Wow.
People are much more likely to finally succeed and keep the weight off the more attempts they have behind them. And really, if you think about it, it's like that George Harrison song, with every mistake, we must surely be learning. I forgot the name of the song. But we are learning machines. And for the most part, for everything worthwhile in life, we fall down and get up until we stay up. And so the name of the game is staying in the game until you win the game.
I love that expression. I know that that's original with you, and I just want you to say it again because I think it's so powerful.
The name of the game is staying in the game until you win the game. And all of the thinking that prevents you from doing it, you've tried 1,000 times before, you should just give up. You need to develop what we call a refutation, a specific argument that disproves that logic. Because, look, if you have an archery target and you get up and you aim with the totality of your soul at the bullseye, and you assess the results every time and you learn what you can and you get up and you aim again, then you're going to get better. I mean, we are trial and error machines. You're going to get better. Just because you've been on a highway for 1,000 miles going in the wrong direction doesn't mean you can't take the next one, right?
Right.
It's very, very important to realize that you'd never tell your kid that while they were learning how to walk or use the potty.
Right.
You fell down so many times, you might as well just stay down and be a crawler the rest of your life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Forget about the potty for you. You're just going to wear diapers. We would never do that. Yet we talk to ourselves like that. And John, there's a reason for it. There's a reason why we treat ourselves differently in this realm than we do in other realms of life. And so many other realms of life, we know we have to keep trying until we get it. And virtually everyone I talk to can give me an experience where maybe they were in college and taking a math class that was really hard, or a language class, or maybe they were learning how to play the piano or learning how to juggle or ride a bicycle, or there's some memory they have in their life where they didn't just instantaneously know how to do something, they had to keep trying. There's a reason why we don't apply that to food. You want to take a guess?
I think you've stumped me here. Well, I know that with food, we have to, it's a daily requirement. We have to continually eat, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it. You're going to have to give me a zero on this one and tell me.
I'm not going to give you a zero. There's a secondary gain associated with failing with food. All those bags and boxes and containers out there are pretty yummy. And if you give up, then you get to eat a lot more of them.
Ah, okay.
Right?
Makes sense.
And so I heard Jack Trimpey call it a toxic pleasure. When you're dealing with a toxic pleasure, something that just tastes too good, there's a kind of limbic payoff. Like there's a gratification of the survival drive, but in a maladaptive way, to viewing yourself as a failure. The takeaway from that is that when you find yourself beating yourself up and saying that you're broken and you're pathetic and a loser and you're just going to be a fat person, whatever, remind yourself that there's this smirking, smiling presence underneath, which really represents your primitive self, your reptilian brain, the part that doesn't really think rationally, but just wants to push everybody out of the way and get the chocolate. It's got this smirking presence that's thinking, oh boy, we're broken. Oh boy, oh boy. So toxic pleasure distracts people wanting to believe that they're broken, but you're not.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned and implied about self-talk. Share with me a little bit about an alternative to beating yourself up. I'm broken. What's the better approach? What approach do you advocate, recommend?
Ask yourself, what did I do right? That's the first question. And it might sound crazy, especially if you've really gone to town, like eating a whole box of Oreos or something. You ask yourself, what did I do right? Like, how was I able to stop when I did? What did I do right in terms of taking care of myself until the moment that I went off my plan? Maybe you had 5 cookies instead of 15. So even though you were trying not to have cookies, you only had 5. How did that happen? What did I do right? And how can I improve? How can I do better next time? In the list of asking yourself what you can do better next time, mostly that will have to do with self care. Starting with nutrition, one of the first places to evaluate is how have you been eating for the last 24 hours or so? And often the point where you overeat is the culmination of maybe having missed getting enough nutrition in the right way or as regularly as you needed to. And then proceeding from nutrition, what about sleep? What about having enough decision free time where you're not impinged upon by everybody asking you a million questions and having to make a million decisions? After that, what about social connectedness? Have you had enough of that in the last 24 hours or so? You kind of work your way down the list until you figure out what was the authentic, genuine biological and then psychological need that you were not meeting, and how would you do better next time? Those are the things you should focus on.
I'm just curious, should you focus on these things on paper? That is to say, should you be writing this down or just thinking it through in your mind?
Well, both. Paper is better because you will be subject to the limitations of short term memory. Because remember, you're working against the pressure to believe that you're a failure. And so you don't want to handicap yourself in any way, but sometimes people just don't have the time to write on paper. But it's better if you look at it in black and white. A computer's fine too, or a smartphone.
Well, yeah, getting it down somewhere. And does getting it down on paper also eliminate some circular reasoning in the brain?
Yeah. Writing is an upper brain activity, whereas panicking is a lower brain activity. Overeating is a lower brain activity. So when you're writing, your breathing tends to slow down a little bit. You move a little bit out of the sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic system, which is the part of us that says it's okay to rest and digest and think and just be, as opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, which says it's time to eat more now. I don't know if we talked about this in the other interviews, but something that's also helpful if you have no medical reason that you can't have leafy green vegetables. If you've made a serious mistake, if you get like a half a pound of leafy green vegetables and you put them in a blender with some water and you drink it down like medicine, what that does is it reminds your survival apparatus that there are still micronutrients and chlorophyll and good stuff available. There's not an awful lot of nutrition in a box of cookies. And so your brain starts to go into a panic that it needs more nutrition, but the taste has distracted you. So it's moving towards more Oreos. And your brain kind of knows that it can't get the nutrition from Oreos. So it feels as if you can't stop. So you can intervene in that process with this, half a pound of leafy green vegetables, drinking it down like water.
So it doesn't really matter how many times you've failed before. What you're saying about strive for perfection, but forgive yourself with dignity, is that it?
Commit with perfection, but forgive yourself with dignity. John, it's not that it doesn't matter how many times you failed before. It does matter. It's better if you failed before more. You've probably learned and you're probably more likely to be able to put this together for yourself. That doesn't mean that if you really haven't tried before, you can't get it right on the first time. Sometimes people do. The route to permanent success goes through repeated failure.
Wow, say that again. Let that sink in.
The route to permanent success with food goes through repeated failure.
Good. That's fantastic. So, what is another thinking trap that people fall into when they come to your program?
Would it be okay if I gave people a little mantra to understand the trap that we're just wrapping up?
Sure, absolutely.
Your lower self, call it your inner food monster, your inner pig, whatever you want to call it. It says you couldn't, so you can't. You couldn't, so obviously you can't. You couldn't, so you can't. But the truth is that people can't until they can. The pig says you couldn't, so you can't. But the truth is that you can't until you can. The route to success goes through repeated failure.
Wow, that's good.
If you hold on to that little mantra, it's a good way to switch paradigms when you find yourself struggling for it. So you wanted to know what other traps people fall into?
Yeah, what's another trap that people fall into? Yes.
The idea that it's too hard to overcome your cravings, to defeat your cravings, and that if you try, you're going to be tortured forever. I could probably talk about this one for an hour.
If you get too long-winded, I'll cut you off, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, the first thing is that it's not true because the brain does not want to waste energy. We are efficiency machines. In fact, that's the reason it often feels like we're binging on autopilot, where you don't even really remember getting into the car and driving to the convenience store and walking in and picking out the bag or box or container and going up to the counter and taking out the money and giving the lady the money and taking the change and taking the package with your hands and going to the car and driving to the back of the parking lot and opening it up and taking it out and putting it in your mouth and chewing it and swallowing it. People will describe that whole process as if it was automatic, as if they almost weren't there. And the reason for that is that the brain is a fan of habit. It wants to create habit so that it can be efficient and not waste any energy, not waste any thinking, planning, strategic energy on finding and acquiring calories. We had to be very good 100,000 years ago at finding and acquiring calories because
Right. It was scarce then.
Yeah. But that very same apparatus that looks for efficiency in thinking, planning, motivating, getting us to do stuff to go find food, it will also release the craving if the craving is not rewarded. It's very specific to each food stimuli. So, for example, if Sally is feeling tortured every time she drives by a pizza place on the way home from work, and she says to herself, oh my God, I can never not do this because I'll just be more and more tortured with cravings. Well, if she goes through a month and she makes an effort to feed herself really well before she gets in the car, and she, gets up in the morning and she journals about why her inner food monster says today's the day she has to have pizza again. And when she gets those cravings, if she takes a bunch of, we call them 7-Eleven breaths, breathe in for a count of 7 and out for a count of 11. And if she pulls over and writes down specifically why the pig wants to justify having, the food monster wants to justify having pizza at this moment, if she does that, there will be a little temper tantrum that her brain will have because it doesn't want to give up its calorie acquisition routine that it worked hard to find and secure and automate. But after that temper tantrum, the brain starts to release. So somewhere between 21 and 30 drives home, she'll hardly experience those cravings at all. An analogy you might think of is like a prisoner that was given a life sentence. At first, they've got hope of escape, and they try everything that they can to try to escape. But after a while, they give up hope, and they don't even want hope. Once they've determined that it's not possible to escape, they don't even want hope because hope is a waste of energy. Make sense?
It makes sense. It reminds me of the learned helplessness, Martin Seligman's experiment that wouldn't be allowed now with the dog in the shocked cage. I don't know if you remember that one or not.
Of course I do. Yeah.
Yes. Same principle. Totally.
Do you want to explain that as long as you're talking about it?
Well, Martin Seligman, who is known as the founder of positive psychology, when he first started out, he was working in helplessness, and he put a dog in a cage and had an electrical shock. And initially the dog would try to get out, move away from the shock. But after a day or two, dog just laid in the cage. They opened the door so the dog could just walk out. But he had learned to be helpless, that he didn't have any control, just lay there and accepted the shock. The experiment would not be allowed today because of cruelty to animals, but it was very interesting how Yeah, our brain adapts to whatever we think is possible or not possible.
The animal part of us doesn't want to waste energy.
Yes, absolutely.
The other reason that you won't be tortured with cravings forever is that your taste buds adapt after about 2 months, and it's more like they adapt like a rheostat than a light switch. This is a phenomenon called downregulation and upregulation. When I was in graduate school, I had a place in Astoria, Queens, which was essentially right under the subway. And for the first couple of weeks I slept there, I just didn't get any sleep. I just couldn't believe how anybody could sleep right underneath the subway. But a few weeks later, I didn't really hear it. And the reason was that my brain stopped responding as if it was a relevant stimuli. It downregulated, or the scientific term would be habituated, or just got used to it. Same thing happens if you have a chocolate bar every day. At first, it's just like unbelievably pleasurable. Like if you haven't had a chocolate bar, it's just like, oh my God, who created this thing? Where did it come from? And let me reorganize my entire life to pursue chocolate. Maybe that's just me.
No, I think that's universal.
No, I'm just kidding. But then if you have it the next day, it's a little less pleasurable. The next day, it's a little less pleasurable, and so on, and so on, and so on. Until at the extreme, people will say they just need their chocolate every day to feel normal. Like they're not really experiencing a lot of pleasure for it. They just need it to feel normal. And correspondingly, because the taste buds and the dopaminergic pleasure response has been so overstimulated, it doesn't react anymore nearly as strongly to natural pleasures in the environment. So people will say they no longer like the way fruit and vegetables taste, and they think that it's hopeless for them to ever eat well again because they know that to really eat well, they're going to have at least some produce, right? But they say that they hate that. It's not really that they hate it, it's that they've overstimulated and downregulated their pleasure systems. Well, the good news is that we also upregulate. The corresponding process works in the reverse direction also. So when I moved away from the subway for a couple of months, and then I went back to visit my friends, I immediately couldn't sleep again because my brain was responding to the subway. Now, if you remove the chocolate, your body will start responding more to natural sugars day by day, just like my nervous system became progressively more sensitive to subway noise when I wasn't overstimulating myself with it every day. Eventually, and the research says it's like 6 to 8 weeks, your taste buds should double in sensitivity and you should have the experience that nature intended for us in response to fruits and vegetables again. So at this point in my life, I have very, very little overstimulating food. I can taste the subtle differences between a Fuji apple and a Gala apple, or between, romaine lettuce and spinach. And most people are saying, oh my God, that sounds impossible. But you don't really have to believe me. It's just something you'll try. You won't be tortured forever because your nervous system will adapt and you will come to like the food that you're eating much better than you do now. Does that make sense, John?
It makes sense. And the time frame is about 6 to 8 weeks.
It's 6 to 8 weeks for something to which you've had daily exposure. We really talk about the number of exposures rather than the very specific amount of time.
Okay.
If you're having a chocolate bar every day, the bulk of your craving should be down to about 20% of where it was in about 30 exposures, 30 days. After 2 months, it should be really very negligible. And that's when your taste buds should have started to come back, depending upon what else you're eating and other addictive cycles that you might be engendering. It's different timing for cravings that you're indulging less frequently. So let's say you had the habit of having pretzels at a poker game on Saturday nights. The cravings will occur for longer, for a couple of months, because it takes a couple of months to get what we call extinction exposures. And extinction exposure is when the thing that triggers the craving is, and you're exposed to the thing that triggers your craving, but you don't indulge it. That's an extinction exposure. And it still takes the same relative number of exposures as it would for a daily habit. So it takes longer to go through the extinction. That's
right.
All.
Okay.
By and large, 80% of what people struggle with are daily cravings.
Right. So just sort of to recap, I think you mentioned this when you were talking about the girl driving by the pizza place, but you've established that it takes a certain amount of time to extinguish the cravings. you're not going to be tortured by these cravings forever. But just recap for the listeners, if you would, what are some of the ways to cope with that period where you're going through the decline or extinguishment of the cravings?
One is to take it seriously and expect that it's going to happen. And let's say the pizza habit is a habit you really want to break. Make that your primary focus is to break that habit. Don't worry so much about whether you're losing weight during that period unless the doctor says that it's urgent. Eat enough that you're not otherwise very hungry, because if you are hungry, then the brain will try to force you to be less discriminating with food. Look at your days and see if you can carve out a few extra decision-free breaks over the course of your day. You might want to carefully tally your nutrition for a few days over that period of time, especially in the beginning, to be sure you're not deficient in anything so your body doesn't have reason to crave beyond calories. Try to plan out a little more social connectedness during that period of time so you can kind of fill up your rewards tank. We're able to regulate our nervous systems with all these different things: decision-free breaks, sleep, healthy food, connectedness to other people. We're able to self-regulate in a way that makes the cravings much easier to deal with. So when you're looking at extinguishing a really serious cravings, take it seriously and make a plan to really take care of yourself during that time.
That's the one thing I want you to just say something else about. Make a plan. Anticipate that you're going to have the craving and have a plan to deal with it.
Yes. And also understand that it's not a linear curve at first. It's not like you're just walking down a mountain and every day brings less and less cravings. What tends to happen is there's a honeymoon period where you feel like this is easy, and then all of a sudden the brain throws a tantrum. A lot of people think they've done something wrong when that occurs for them, and they'll give up and say, well, this is impossible. But if you know that's what's going to happen, then you're prepared and you don't give up and you write it out. Your pig says that you're going to be deprived forever and you're going to be tortured with these cravings forever. The truth is, the worst of it's in the first couple of weeks, and you should be done with it after a couple of months at most. The other truth is that the way to make the cravings last forever is to keep indulging. The only way that cravings will last forever is if you keep indulging them.
So the worst thing you can do is break your plan and reignite the craving. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. The last thing I would say is that most people feel as if there should be an easy route. And I will say, what if the sad truth was, and please don't shoot the messenger, that there are two very difficult routes and you have to choose between them. One difficult route involves some uncomfortable cravings for, especially the first few weeks, and then a gradual lessening of them until they don't bother you, and then that lasts the rest of your life. The other route involves feeling tortured with cravings the rest of your life. So sometimes you have to choose which hard path to take. Sometimes there is no easy route. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. It's a principle that we've talked about in other contexts. Choose the short pain. And during the 6 weeks or 8 weeks, whatever it is a lot. It might be more intense, but it's shorter than the lifetime of fighting the cravings.
Right. It's like you always say, pull off the Band-Aid.
But rip it off. Don't try to do it gently. Rip it off. Absolutely.
Which I always resonated with because I got a lot of hair in my arms. So, I'm a big gorilla. Can we talk about another trap or two?
Sure.
I call this one the confuse and conquer squeal because my inner pig used to tell me that I couldn't really get things together until I found the perfect diet. At first, I went back and forth between low carb and vegetarian. And then I went back and forth between different types of vegetarian diets. Is it vegetarian? Is it vegan? Is it whole foods, plant-based? And then I went back and forth between should it be raw foods or cooked vegan diet. And eventually what I realized was that the ambivalence was destroying me and that it would be better to pick one and stay with it than to try to find the perfect one first. Let's say I had a diet that was 80% correct and I was confident it was 80% correct. It would be much better to pick that and stick with it than to agonize about how do I get to the 100% correct diet and then binge in between, because chaos would prevail, and also because obsessing and deciding really wears down your willpower. It just gives you an awful lot to think about, and it makes it difficult to be present for life, but it also makes it difficult to make good decisions about food because you're always doubting yourself. And doubt and insecurity are like psychological cancers when it comes to overeating. I discovered that in order to develop confidence, in order to eventually lose the weight, I'd have to stick to something. When I work with clients like this, I tell them that, look, there's always going to be controversy about what dietary philosophy is perfect. And when I think I know what the best one is, probably they do also, whoever's listening. Can you get 10 people in a room who are going to agree on the best way to eat? I think that's almost impossible. But if you pick a plan and develop the ability to stick to it for a couple of months, then you'll be able to evaluate realistically how it works for you. And then you can make small changes if you need to and stick to that. The mantra I use to remember all this is that the grass isn't greener on the other side, the grass is greener where it's watered. I forgot who said that first. Do you know, John?
I don't, but it's certainly true.
Yeah. But it's amazing how much of their lives people spend, like years and years, agonizing about what the exact right diet is. I tell people just pick something you're reasonably sure is good for you, 80% at least, and make it your Bible for a couple of months, and then change it at that time if you need to. Because if you can't stick to anything, you're not going to get anywhere.
Absolutely.
The last thing I would say is that if you feel very tempted to constantly change your food plan, you can create a rule that says you don't allow yourself to make any changes to your food rules other than on the first of the month, or a more lenient version of that would be only on Sundays. But if you're finding yourself jumping around too much, you can say, okay, I only changed my plan on the first of the month. Those are the major traps, John. I mean, people will also say it's just as easy to start tomorrow or start Monday. We can do a whole call on that.
I tell people, when I'm coaching clients around business, if you're going to start next week never comes. Start today. Today's the only day there is. Start today.
The reason it doesn't come is because if you say, I'm going to indulge today and start tomorrow, when you have the thought, let's start tomorrow, you've actually reinforced that thought. So it's more likely to occur tomorrow, and you've reinforced the craving.
Right. Makes total sense. Can you sum up? Is there a summary? Can you say that you're going to fail? Not only are you going to fail, you should expect to fail, but instead of beating yourself up, you ask yourself what you learned from it. How can you benefit from this? Accept that the road to success goes through failure. And if you think it's going to be too hard, you need to give that thought up, because as you follow the process, work through the plan, those cravings just gradually diminish, because that's the way the brain works. And then there is no such thing as a perfect diet, perfect plan. Don't strive for that. Find something that works for you. Stick with it. Is that a fair summary?
That's a good summary, John. The only thing I would add to it is that despite the fact that the path to success goes through repeated failure, every time that you aim at the bullseye and set out to succeed again, you want to commit with perfection.
If you commit with perfection, you forgive with dignity.
Yes.
I learned that from you, and I really like that, because if you have a misstep, fail, beating yourself up is the worst thing. Because another thing I learned from you, when you ask yourself, what's wrong with me, then your brain automatically starts looking for confirmation of things that are wrong with you.
And then you develop a failure identity.
Yes. And you don't want that.
You miss the bullseye, figure out by how much and what direction, and make adjustments.
Very good. This was very helpful, very enlightening. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it.
And that brings us to the end of today's broadcast of Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston. If you'd like to find out more about the products and services Dr. Glenn offers to help you dramatically reduce your cravings and stop overeating in 90 days or less, please visit defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. That's defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. Thanks.